Well, here we are on the banks of the Flint River in Bainbridge, Georgia, and I want to talk about a site that's significant with the First Seminole War. That's was a park in Georgia. I've covered it in the past, but it just received an upgrade, so I want to cover that. Hope you'll enjoy a quick tour here as soon as I can find the share screen. Okay. This is Chason Park in Bainbridge, Georgia, in the northwest corner of the park. I believe this is the corner of Florida and Jackson Street. Florida is the one going into the park. Here, the pavement you see is Jackson Street. Anyway, what happened is that in the this park is called Chason Park, and it's where Fort Hughes was, which we'll see that in a minute. So I parked here, took a photograph of the gate, went through the gate, and it won't advance. Let's go. Oh, here we are. Yep, there's the pavement historic Chason Park. Going down here, there's a historical marker. Chason is the name of the family that donated this property to the city of Bainbridge about 100 years ago. So I think it's the Daughters of the American Revolution put up some markers. So walking down the sidewalk here through that entrance, there's several magnificent oaks that are over 200 years old that they were probably little smaller trees when Fort Hughes was here back in 1817. So what happened is, in fact, there's a fountain here. I think that's might have been part of the old park, but it's been cleaned up. You see there's two cannons flanking the fountain, one on the right here and one over on the left. Let's look at from the fountain, the cannon on the right. That says Fort Scott on it. This cannon was originally at the site of Fort Scott, which I've covered in other videos. That was a fort built on the confluence of the Flint and Chattahoochee River, where it forms the Apalachicola. That fort was built as a result of Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort to observe the area. And after the Americans destroyed it, then they kept the fort here to observe the river traffic coming up from Spanish Florida. And the fort was active as a military post for about 5 years until Florida was transferred over to the United States. Then Fort Scott was abandoned, named after General Winfield Scott. Although I think there's, a Lieutenant Richard Scott who was killed near here, no relations. And on the other side of that fountain is this other cannon, which was here. And this cannon was marking Fort Hughes. And we'll talk about Fort Hughes in a minute. In fact, it's probably over the site where is buried the musician Aaron Hughes, who was killed at the Battle of Fowltown. So the archaeological excavation did not find his bones or burial, and it's rumored that the cannon's over his grave. In fact, they had granite base on both of these cannons. That's Georgia granite. I think that's from Stone Mountain. Here's a marker, I think also from the DAR. Anyway, talking about Early County, how large it used to cover this area. This is now Decatur County. Here's another champion oak, and then going down that sidewalk, coming, we'll come into some posts, and I said, "What's that?" And so I look up, and the plaque reads Fort Hughes, 1817. This was the corner of the fort. What happened is that, of course, I talked about this in earlier videos. The army from Fort Scott attacked Fowltown. Uh, that at first tried to capture Neamathala, attacked it unprovoked, really, and surprised the people there. A lot of the men were gone, and they're returning as the army attacks, and they fire and drive the soldiers off. 2 days later, 300 soldiers return, and they're under the command of Matthew Arbuckle, who at this time is with the 7th Infantry. And at this time, the army overruns the town, 300 soldiers, ransacks the town, takes the cattle, I think takes the corn out of the crib, takes the food from the people in the town, and I think they burn it to the ground either at that attack or maybe soon after. So the Georgia militia takes the cattle and they come up here and build Fort Hughes on the Flint River. And I think why they build it here is just to keep a watch of the Seminoles coming up the Flint River, guarding the Georgia plantations and settlements further upriver. And it's named after a musician, Aaron Hughes, who in the second battle, that for some reason he says, I know what to do. I'll go on top of this hut and rally the soldiers. So he goes up on top of the building where he makes a great target, and he's shot and killed. And he's the one soldier that's killed a musician, the first soldier that's killed starting 41 years of warfare between the United States and the Seminole Indians. And he's taken and buried up here. Georgia militia takes the cattle, drives the cattle up to Fort Gaines further up the Chattahoochee River. So the Indians are quite annoyed at this point. And after the soldiers build the fort, I think it's like 90 feet by 90 feet and maybe about 140 soldiers. I can't remember the exact number in the fort. The Indians can come and put it to siege. I think they put siege about for a couple weeks until a command of soldiers comes from Fort Scott and drives them off, and then they abandon Fort Hughes. And Matthew Arbuckle, I think he is a major at that point. He's promoted to colonel, and he does such a great job riling up the Seminoles that he goes out west, and he eventually ends up at I think it's Fort Fort Gibson, and also Fort Smith, Arkansas. And so he's pretty much the military official in charge of Indian policy for the next 30 years. Kind of the worst person you want to put in charge, but actually he does a pretty good job and keeps the peace at that point. So, maybe he learned from his mistakes here. And so in Chason Park, you have the corner of where the fort was that they determined this from the recent archaeological excavation. And then there's these 3 interpretive panels, which are really neat, giving the history of it. History and location of Fort Hughes. It had 2 corner blockhouses put under siege. And, he shows some pictures of the archaeological work. And there's a little, one of those QR codes that you can put your phone up to and go to the webpage and get more information. On the ground here, there's a concrete circle that's marked off the directions and distance of various points. Like that way is to Fort Hughes, which, you're basically there. And that direction runs the road that goes between St. Augustine and Pensacola. It comes up here into what's now Georgia. And that was during the British period, of course. And mainly, I guess, to get on some high ground and out of the swampland. That direction is Fowltown, 4 miles. Battle of Fowltown, but that's where Fowltown was. And there is of course, pointing to Camp Recovery, which was the kind of the hospital of Fort Scott, which was on the land side, up the hill from the river, supposed to be healthier air. and that direction's Fort Scott, 15 miles. So you see Fort Scott and Fowltown were pretty much in walking distance back then. No wonder they got in trouble. And here's another interpretive panel about the history going from the DeSoto coming through here, supposedly establishing a British trading post, what's now Bainbridge. In fact, there's another historical marker in town about this. And then Camp Hughes, and eventually the riverboat traffic going up and down the Flint River. And of course, another interpretive panel, the new beginnings, talking about how this area became an important military operations area uh, from the because of the location of Fowltown. And of course, the importance of the fort being here is overlooking the Flint River. This was important for trade because it goes up to the heart of Georgia, up from here. And walking around the fort makes a really great pedestrian area. And they have a playground too. And that's Chason Park, Fort Hughes in Bainbridge, Georgia. And I went there during New Year's Day. And so if you're interested in visiting historical sites, especially, lesser known ones, then I recommend this. Okay. I hope you enjoyed the quick tour.